This is my good friend, Derek Nemeth. You don't need to do anything. He's already... We're live.
Good. It's all good? Yeah.
It's a hot mic.
Hot mic.
So this is my good friend, Derek Nemeth. My name is Chris. You've seen me on stage all day, the editor of Brewbound. Derek has a really interesting background, somebody who takes an interesting point of view as it relates to the sort of M&A environment with craft. And you... When we talk about
I feel like
this,
we're a little too close.
Yeah, well, we can. Yeah, there we go. When we talk about this stuff together, it's always a bit different than the conversations we have on stage. So I kind of wanted to, at least bring part of that conversation here to the Livestream Lounge. You ran a hedge fund back in the day.
Yep.
So talk to me about your experience running a hedge fund, what you saw in other industries, and why you think similar trends or similar things will happen to the beer space.
Okay. Well, through running a hedge fund, I got to spend some time in Germany, which is where my craft beer story started, really. I got to see the culture there that has been in place for 400 years back in the 90s, and really before it took off in the U.S. the way it has. So when I came back, I was very interested in craft beer as it started to grow, and that's basically how it started for me. What was interesting about craft beer for so long is that it's always had this belief by the pioneers that the typical way that M&A happens isn't the way it's going to work for them.
Right.
What's been most interesting to me in the last few years is that whole thinking kind of changed on a dime. I mean, I came to this event in 2012,
Yeah.
and
Totally different.
I mean, there was only one other guy that did the kind of things that I do.
Yeah.
And now I see new faces every time I come to these events. So, yeah, and the interesting thing is the brewers have changed on a dime too.
Right.
Their view of how they look at private equity and family office.
Right. How they value their own companies.
Right.
I mean,
well,
it's all,
that's part of it, right?
or how others value their companies.
The valuations kind of drove what they think of the environment.
Right.
If they had a private equity shop offering them 8 times EBITDA, which was the way it was 10 years ago, they're not as interested. But when they're offering double that, it makes it more interesting, especially when these guys have a good sense for the future prospects for growth.
Money talks.
Sure. Even in this business.
So what, as a hedge fund manager, what industries were you either invested in or paying attention to? And, are there similar industries that are, built on manufacturing or built on hard assets that had a similar growth sort of curve, and then what happened when they sort of got to that peak of that curve in whatever industry it was, and do you think that's, what we could see in beer, in craft beer specifically?
Well, I think we already are. I mean, if you look at brewing versus other industries on a CapEx per revenue basis, it's along the lines of the chemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, which are known for being dominated by few large players. And you now have the same sort of thing fleshing out in craft brewing, the few large players being
consolidators,
the former enemy.
Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, ABI and the other macros doing what they've done is a really smart play, and that probably is the reason that you're seeing them pay such high premiums for these craft brands, is because they dominate the distribution side so much that all they need to do is be in the craft game, and they have a good toehold on whatever happens in the future.
Right. So distribution's key. One of the interesting things on the last panel before we broke for lunch, Finn from Southern Tier had sort of hinted at the fact that he doesn't believe the buyer pool is as large as some people think. So yes, we know that Anheuser-Busch is an acquirer. We know that there are these groups like True Craft and Enjoy Beer and Fireman and ABV either doing deals or have expressed their intention of doing deals, and certainly all the other strategic and foreign companies that are also supposedly looking at the space. But if the buyer pool is as small as he sort of hinted as it being, when all those other guys that I just mentioned get their fill, do we start to see the valuations come down?
There's a lot in that question. I don't probably have as clear of a picture as Finn does. I mean, he's an insider. But I feel like very recently I've heard a lot of chatter about Asian strategics getting more involved. I've actually spoken to some of them about that, and they are interested. So I don't know if I disagree. I definitely think there's more in the strategic pool than there were 2 years ago. ABI, obviously, but I think the realignment for Miller Coors is definitely going to improve their chances. As I said, Asia. I do also think, though, as these consolidation groups get established, it kind of forces out the new entrants from being able to compete with them.
Right.
Because you have a group like an ABV, they're going to be able to pay a higher premium for the third brand.
Right.
Because they've got the potential for the synergies, as Paul alluded to in his talk, that somebody who's new and trying to set up a group wouldn't have.
But I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to buy that third brand, like, I don't know, in the next couple of months, because, as he said, they're still trying to figure out how to work Victory into the system, and they're ironing out all the details there. So, I guess you look around the space and you see a lot of these groups. They've all done these deals, and they're kind of in this waiting period right now. And my question is like, well, all right, if they're all trying to figure out, okay, we wrote the check, we're trying to integrate these companies. Does the lack of activity for even a period of 3 to 6 months, when we had been seeing a deal or two per month, does that cause the valuations to come down at all?
I think that it's what's gone on with ABV is pretty typical of any acquisition. And it's all relative, and that's why maybe it's a little confusing in the beer space, because when you look at ABI doing 3 deals in 2 weeks or whatever it was,
right,
you have to consider the fact that that's over $100 billion company doing, 9 or 10 figure deals,
right,
whatever. Small deals. Small deals relative
right.
to their total value.
Right.
ABV they're not $100+ billion fund.
Right.
So their deals are probably going to come slower than ABI's would.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, as that process goes through and they kind of digest the deal, that's when you'll see them able to put more money to work.
Right. In terms of just the overall growth of the category, is this kind of pace of brewery openings sustainable? Again, like thinking back to some of the other industries that you've watched or been invested in, have you seen this kind of growth in other industries? And if so, like what happened like after 2.5 companies in that space opened up per day or whatever?
Right. Well, I mean, I always think about the fact that you've got all these guys in craft now coming out with a very similar story, as similar to the internet bubble in the 90s,
right,
where everybody was starting an internet company in their garage. But I don't think it really plays out as a crash the way that did, because that was obviously a crash.
Sure.
I think what happens with these smaller breweries as you go forward is if they don't find a good place for themselves, and distribution's the biggest game right now, maybe there's a change in business model, and if there is closings, I think it takes on more of a slow train wreck sort of appearance, where somebody knows they're going to be going out of business for a while,
right,
rather than it all happening shockingly at once.
Right.
But I do think that where we were in the late 1800s is a high point that eventually sunk down
Yep.
during consolidation. I think you'll see that same sort of effect. Obviously, not going to as low of a point that it eventually went to.
Right, but not as drastic, but some kind of dip.
Yeah.
I know we're just about out of time, but final question, 10 seconds. If you could buy a brewery in the space right now that hasn't already been invested in, who would it be?
Wow, that's that's a tough one. I'd have to think about that. And
How
get
about
back
a
to you.
size brewery? Like,
It
would
would-
you
I'd
go
be,
after a top 50 or would you go smaller?
No, I'd be playing in the smaller guys that are still growing. I mean, plenty of guys have said it on the stage today. Growth is where it's at for investors.
Huh?
The top 50 aren't growing like they used to.
Right. There you go. Buy a small brewery. Small brewers out there, go find a buyer. Thank you, Derek.